My name, yay! I'm Jesse Houle. Most of you watching this probably know that because you're probably friends with me on Facebook, and that's how you saw this. But since it's public, I don't know if I know all of you yet. I'm running for District 6 Commissioner, and I'm in Athens-Clarke County, and I'm trying to do these kitchen table chats, which uses Facebook Live, and there's kind of this funky setup we try to use to make it work. And it's been extra funky today, but I think we've made it work. There are emojis flying across the screen, which is delightful. And so I'm joined today by Erin Stacer, who is the president of Athens for Everyone, and is going to ask me things about Athens for Everyone's questionnaire, my responses to it, and the intersection of my platform and theirs, and whatever the heck else you want to throw at me. So, Erin, while I try to get these links up on the other pages again, do you want to introduce yourself and talk about what A4E is about?
Sure. So hi, again, if you were listening the first time, but you probably weren't because that went weird. I'm Erin Stacer. I'm the current president of Athens for Everyone, and we are a local grassroots political advocacy group. We actually have Jesse Houle is one of the founding members of Athens for Everyone, if you didn't know. So we really appreciate them and their perspective on a lot of things. We have our 2020 platform that I could talk a little bit about if Jesse needs more time.
I would love for you to talk about your platform. That would be so good. Yeah.
Plus,
your platform's really exciting, so, you know.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we worked really hard on it, and we're pretty happy with it. So we're really focusing in 2020. We're trying to kind of dial in a little more on specifically what Happens for Everyone does amidst all these other nonprofits that exist here in Athens. We're so lucky that we live in this town, this city that cares so much, and there are so many nonprofits and lots of people trying to do lots of good, cool things. So we want to make sure that we are working together and not, stepping on each other's toes or repeating the same kind of work that really just end up getting in the way versus collaborating. So our big goal this year is to really focus on coalition building. So we like to work with our coalition partners. We have Athens Anti-Discrimination Movement. We have Economic Justice Coalition, 100% Athens, which is also a coalition. So there's like a bunch of other orgs also involved in that one.
I want to see a Venn diagram of all the coalitions overlapping.
Right? Yeah, because now we have a new one. We have our mutual aid group here in Athens is pretty much a coalition.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so with that emphasis on coalition building and political education, or basically, it's hard to find the right word there. I always don't like to say political education because it sort of sounds like you're talking down to people, but more like getting out information, spreading information, disseminating information.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll just list their platform and have it right in front of me. So our first platform item is to collaborate with Economic Justice Coalition to advocate for improving and sustaining the Athens-Clarke County Prosperity Package. Now, that will have to be a little bit altered, I imagine. Not that it will no longer exist, because we are using right now the prosperity package money is going to be used as emergency funds for the county amidst this health and economic crisis.
Is that something that you want to take a minute to chat about?
Yeah. Are you done making links?
Yeah, I got all the links are up, as far as I can tell. Yeah.
Now you did a good job. Okay. Yeah. Do you want to talk about the prosperity package a little bit? What's your take on the commission deciding to use $3 million from the prosperity package for relief here in Athens?
Yeah, so I'm actually really glad that they decided to do that. I think there might be some misconceptions floating around about how that money got to be designated as the prosperity package in the first place.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I've heard people talking about like rating the prosperity package, and the prosperity package was surplus money that people were kind of debating a year ago whether to add to the county's emergency funds or to create this fund that they would call the prosperity package, with the idea being to combat poverty and inequality, the heavy emphasis on equity, and thinking about racial justice and actually putting some money behind it. And so the idea was to, what's that?
Sorry, was that Athens for Everyone's proposal for an equity package? Is this the same thing, or that's what you're talking about?
I'm thinking about when the mayor and commission first established the prosperity package, and it seemed like they were taking a play out of y'all's book and like various community leaders who were modeling what West Bellamy did in Charlottesville and trying to do something similar here, to set up programming that would really make a difference longer term. And my understanding of what they've done by moving that money into emergency funding right now is to essentially focus on the same folks, that they really want to focus on vulnerable people, the most marginalized people first. But now that we're in this emergency situation, instead of applying it to long-term programming, it's applying it to the immediate need in the wake of coronavirus and the impact that's happening on the economy and on people's health, obviously, and well-being. And then I think the hope is to replenish that fund after, if and when there's another surplus, or if there can be federal money that comes in to replace it. So, what I think is a good use of why I think this is a good use of those funds is because I'm not sure what the other source would be. If I think there's a question about that surplus money that's in like the emergency reserve, and how much of that is needed to literally like keep the water treatment plant running and the sewers working, versus how much of that could be used for direct aid to people around the community beyond the city's infrastructure. But I've heard people throw around this idea of like, why not use the SPLOST money or other money that exists on the county level. And the SPLOST money is like specifically earmarked by a referendum vote that the whole county took, so they can't legally move any of that without holding another referendum vote. And if they were going to
because the voting populace voted for it.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And I'm not like actually a huge fan of a lot of the things that are on that list. But the idea that like
you
all that
voted
money
against
going.
It, didn't you?
What?
I said you voted against it, didn't you?
I did actually vote against the SPLOST, mostly because I thought the way that they went against the Citizen Advisory Committee's recommendation to keep the Classic Center off, which is only one item on the list, but takes up $40 million, which is a huge chunk of change. I think that money could be much better spent on things like what the prosperity package was aimed at trying to do. But now that money's allocated, it's basically stuck there, unless another referendum vote were held. And even then, I'm actually not super sure of the process of whether they could do that. But it certainly wouldn't be an emergency thing.
Right. Yeah. And it's kind of also one of those things where when we talk about funding, we talk about money, it's very hard for me, I think, to grasp sometimes, because things like SPLOST money, when we talk about that, I mean, aren't we kind of talking about money that it's like anticipated money because it's a sales tax?
Yeah, there's a couple ways they can go about it. They can take out like a bond to have the money up front and then pay it back. And that's what they're doing with I think a portion, not the entirety of the SPLOST money. But you'll see that actually like a portion of the budget for SPLOST includes paying back bonds. So there's some infrastructure projects that they'll pay for up front and then repay, essentially like loans they took out. But yeah, like the money for SPLOST isn't actually revenue that's been generated yet and is sitting in the account. It's money that's anticipated to be generated through a bunch of sales. And of course, like those sales are also down right now. So, I'm guessing that among the many ripple effects of this whole COVID-19 shelter-in-place situation we're in, is that timelines for things like the SPLOST projects are probably going to have to be dragged out longer than people thought.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a lot of change and concessions we'll probably have to make, at least for immediate time relief in this time.
Yeah. One thing I wonder about when we're talking about emergency funds is which things could be shut down or reduced to give us money. And I don't know how easy it is to calculate that stuff on the fly, but we're trying to pull people out of the jail,
Right.
and a lot of times I think there's this attitude that the county government has a ton of money and it is managing a massive budget, and I think there are ways to trim that budget and make it more efficient in things. But when I think about where the inefficiency really is, I think it's in the criminal justice system, and the fact that the majority of the county's budget year after year, the general fund, not SPLOST money that's specially earmarked or anything, but that general fund is going to public safety, and that includes things like fire departments that we need, but it's also everything with the courts and everything with the jail. So I'd love to see us stop putting so many people in jail and take that money and put it elsewhere, like funding things that the prosperity package could do.
Yeah, I love that. Less people in jail, please. Yeah, actually, I mean, we can kind of segue into talking about criminal justice. I know that you have on your platform something about criminal justice. Do you want to clarify that? Since I don't have it right in front of me.
The transforming public safety. And rethinking policing as social work is how we like to summarize that. So I had this kind of enlightening exchange with a UGA police officer a while back, where I was with someone who's having a really rough time, and a bunch of police showed up on the scene from the university's police department, which is separate from the Clarke County Police Department for anybody who doesn't know. But we were talking about kind of what we do, me working at UG Space, this person working at the university, and how that's like generally social work, and we started talking about social work programming. And the officer said, like, oh, that just seems so hard. I can't imagine doing that. And I thought to myself, I said this to him. I said, I'd like to think that in an ideal world, your job actually is social work. If that's really what your role is. And this light bulb kind of went off in my head as someone who's talked a lot about like police brutality and how we, kind of radically transform these systems to look very different. What does it mean to abolish prison or abolish policing, the way we might hear people talk about? And I think it's about really, really rethinking what policing is. And if we think of it as social work, then suddenly it becomes about trying to provide people with service, trying to de-escalate conflict and create a better community together while making people safe in the immediate, instead of thinking of it as like looking for people who are disobeying rules and then holding them accountable according to the system's tools for, holding people accountable, which usually means punishment in the form of fines and locking people in cages and things. And so, so just taking that attitude to how, like, I would approach being on the commission and thinking about how we fund public safety departments, what we task them with doing, the kinds of policies that we're giving them to uphold, as well as the kinds of laws that we have on the books for people to enforce or not. And so, like, what reasons do we give for people to be given a fine in the first place or to be put in jail? What are the grounds for arrest? What are the reasons we might give for people to have an interaction with a police officer in the first place? And if we take this attitude of looking at policing like social work, looking at the role that the local government might have to play in keeping people safe as more of a social work lens, then I think we begin to pretty dramatically change how at least certain things function on the local level. We don't view fines as revenue streams, except, if we're going to charge a fine, maybe it's to make up for the immediate need that was created by whatever that fine was charged for. But we don't look at fines as a way of making money to pay for other things in the general fund. And we don't look at people who are locked in cages as free labor that we can exploit by only letting them out to work for us and then otherwise making them stay in the prison. So.
Oh yeah, that is also a good thing that I think we should elaborate on, because you actually were the person who I mean, you introduced me to this. I had no idea that we use unpaid inmate labor. The city uses unpaid inmate labor.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I mean, that's part of the problem of like locking people away is, unless we know somebody in the prison or in the jail, we might not be aware of like how abysmal that situation might be and all the things that are really messed up about it. The private contracts with phone companies that make it extremely difficult to place phone calls because they're very expensive, et cetera, et cetera. And so in the case of, unpaid inmate labor, Georgia's one of, I think, 2 or 3 states where it is legal to pay people $0 to work for your county government or corporation if what's called insourcing. So we outsource labor, is what jails do to like the public sector, but then jails also insource labor and like have people in prisons working for private companies, bagging coffee for Starbucks or whatnot. That's not happening in Athens, the private company part. But there are a couple hundred folks in the state prison who are doing free labor for Athens-Clarke County government.
Is there any money exchanged then between the prison and the jail to the city, between the city, like does the city pay them, the jails or the prison to have these inmates work? Like, I know the inmates might not be making money, but is there somebody making money?
Well, yeah, so I like to call it a diabolical handshake, So like when we talk about the Linentown Resolution, there is this diabolical handshake between the University of Georgia system and the city government, is the Athens city government back in the 60s, and state and federal entities. And so in the case of like this prison industrial complex that we have, the prison system, the state prison system, performs these diabolical handshakes with local governments where they say, well, if you house this facility on your land and staff it with your people, so it's run by our sheriff and everything, then we will give you this free labor. Most of the people who are there are going to perform work for you. And so then the county government sees that as a savings by using those folks' labor instead of having to pay people to perform essential functions in the community. So they're doing everything from like working at the airport to helping with the stormwater maintenance and sewage maintenance and garbage cleanup. And there are unpaid incarcerated laborers that are only let out of the prison working in most of the Clarke County government's departments in some fashion or another. Very spread out. And so we didn't really know how this was all operating until we started trying to dig in and ask. And not unlike the fight for living wages for county workers years ago, it opened up a much bigger can of worms than we even thought it would. In 2 big ways. The living wage component is the second one. The first one is that we realized just how extensive this is, that most people in the prison are working somehow for the local government, that they're getting paid $0. So we didn't know if it was like, do you get something on your commissary, or like you'll hear people get like 40 cents an hour or $5 a day or something in a lot of other states, which is still disgusting and nowhere near what people should get paid to do this work. But at least it's something. And then we learned here it's $0.00. Supposedly how this is made up for, besides them quote unquote paying their debt to society, is that they get like their sentences might be reduced, or they get access to other job training programs. This is seen as like valuable skill building and job training for these people. Yeah. So before I get to my number 2, I see you just making lots of disgusted faces. I don't know if you want to just say anything.
Well, I mean, it's disgusting. I agree with that. I think unpaid labor is paid labor, and that's awful. But what has that's going to change or has changed only slightly.
There was an attempt to change it that failed. So
an attempt that failed.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple years ago is when we started digging into this. This was kind of the last big project I took on before I stepped down from the Athens for Everyone board and stuff. And we dug into this open records request. So this is the second point, and then I'll get to your question, Erin, is that the county budget has a line, has this line on it for the value that they regard this labor at. And so just doing super rudimentary math, if you divide the number of hours that are budgeted for people to labor into the amount of money total, you end up with what would be the value that they say it would be total. You end up with $18 an hour. So what the county is doing is locking people in cages, or agreeing with the state to house a facility where the state is locking people in cages. And then the county says, well, we'll let you out only if you do this labor for free. This labor that we acknowledge in writing is worth $18 an hour. Meanwhile, we had to fight to get people being paid, $10.60 an hour for work for the wage floor in Athens-Clarke County. And so we have people getting paid under $18 an hour to supervise inmate laborers that are getting paid $0 an hour. When the buried budget item values that at $18 an hour. So is there actually $18 an hour being paid to the county? No, that money doesn't exist in a liquid form anywhere in the budget, but that is how it's valued. And so, ending the practice of unpaid inmate labor would mean that we would take these couple hundred jobs and turn them into paid jobs. Of course, we'll have to find a way to actually pay for those jobs. And I think that we should. I think that's an ethical imperative. I think you're right that this is exactly like slavery. This is the most obvious extension of slavery that we have to this day. And the farthest we've gotten so far was that Tim Denson, pretty early on when he got on the commission, pushed for an amendment to the budget when they were in the budget process of paying inmates for their labor. And so he was advocating for what ended up being a few $1 million in total. And that would have averaged, I think, like $4 a day or something. It was, or maybe, I forget. It was a very small amount of money, but comparable to what anywhere else in the South is doing. So it was sort of like, it's better than zero, but still awful, right? And we could, I think, have a pretty good, fruitful conversation around whether it's better to pay people a pittance or to opt out of the system entirely. That's a debate Tim and I have had quite a bit since, because, and this is the last thing I'll say right now, the Georgia State Department of Corrections then made a policy within their institution that they wouldn't take the money. So the Clarke County government budgeted this money in our budget to pay these people something. And then the Georgia Department of Corrections said they wouldn't take it. And so now it's kind of back to the drawing board of how can we get these people paid. And that's where, especially after that attempt was made, I think that what we should do is break the diabolical handshake, opt out of that agreement entirely, close down the state prison, and stop participating in this prison industrial complex in its most just ugly form. We're getting some comments on the side, so do you want to follow up on that, Erin, and then I'll see what people are saying?
Yeah, actually, I agree pretty wholeheartedly that we need to be paying people for their labor, and that the idea that they're paying their debt to society is such a backward thought process. Staying in jail is not paying a debt. In fact, it ruins people's lives and tends to create recidivism. And it's just, I agree with it on, I disagree with the prison system on so many levels. But I thought you articulated quite well an argument for why people, at least in the current system as it is, should be getting paid. in lieu of changing the system completely.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think part of how we participate in changing the prison system when we're talking about leveraging the power the local government might have is to opt out of these really toxic, awful agreements and try to build something better. And so, paying people living wage jobs, building an economy where people can thrive, I think is a proven way, of reducing crime and the things that lead to people ending up in these situations in the first place.
Wait, you mean if people have resources and are able to live their lives comfortably, they don't commit as many crimes?
Yeah.
Or at least what we consider crimes, right? Because then there's people who are very comfortable committing a lot of crimes, and they're not going to prison.
Yeah. Somehow, Wall Street just keeps getting bailed out.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It can be our health.
Yeah. Sometimes we put criminals in very, very high positions of power. Anyway.
Yeah, the highest.
Yeah, the highest. I think there is this question that lingers from this of what do we do with inmate, people who are wrapped up in the system right now. They're incarcerated and they are locked in these cages and not let out. And so, Tim's response has been, well, if we close down the state prison here, they're going to go somewhere else. They'll move the facility somewhere else, and it will probably be run by a county government that's going to treat people much more poorly. And we don't know if that's true, although I think the odds are that probably is true. So there is kind of this question of well, how much do we take a principled stand at the expense of the well-being of the people who are housed there? And I think that's a tough question to grapple with, but where I think the best ethical outcome is to stop participating in this thing that if we continue to participate in, if we, with this government, with this supposed blue dot in the Red Sea, if we're continuing to participate, it ain't going anywhere, right? So we've got to, I think, do our best to end it, publicize why, try to spread the word, and become part of the advocacy to change the whole system. But then when we talk about the direct impact on lives, most folks who are housed in that state prison here aren't actually from Athens-Clarke County, right?
Right.
But what I think we can offer is that those jobs that are currently being done by people in prison are jobs that we give to people as soon as they're out of prison. So whether it's someone who's in Clarke County before they were incarcerated or not, they could be eligible for that job. And so I think that's a way to be helping kind of that same population of people who are caught up in the system, while also building a way to break the chains, so to speak, and quite literally. We had some comments I wanted to, Chris was commenting on some things, kind of just agreeing with us earlier about prosperity package stuff, I think, and then said, unless Bernie Sanders wins, haha. A lot of things that'll be different if Bernie Sanders wins, but and I'd love to see that happen, but we'll see. Please vote for Bernie if you can.
Please vote for Bernie Sanders.
Hi, Antonio. Antonio says they're on watching. And I'm not sure when you said Louisiana is one, I think, isn't Angola prison there. If you want to elaborate on what you meant by that, I'd be happy to chat. It says, government can argue that it costs, I think, about $40K to house, feed, etc. a prisoner. So government looks at it like the prisoner owes society and the government has to foot the bill, says Antonio Garcia. I think you're right that is an argument that we often hear. And I think that speaks to this idea of our society being a series of individualized agreements and debts. And instead of seeing it as a system that we're all collectively participating in, there are individual actors, and we kind of ignore the context that those individuals live in. And so, I think if we think of the debt as really on society, what argument we have for putting people in a prison-like state is to keep us, quote unquote, safe, right?
Right.
And so I think really we should dramatically reduce, very much so, the number of people who are put in jail or prison at all, and then really reconfigure what a prison looks like, so it doesn't look much at all like what prison looks like these days, and looks a lot more like maybe what we see in Scandinavian countries, where people can freely move around and have visitation and things and do meaningful work, connect with each other, but they're still like monitored and sort of living in like a geographically nearby exile. But then I think like we also look at that as both a public benefit, a public good, that like, you know, okay, we're being kept safe because these serial killers or whatever are sort of over here, but also a public responsibility to continue providing folks resources and to really see this as ultimately like a healthcare issue and a mental health issue. That like somebody who's so out of line with what the rest of us think works for society that we collectively need to keep them away from the rest of us. You know, if that's true, I think that pretty obviously meets the characteristics of mental illness, you know? And so if we, again, take that kind of social work attitude of like, well, how do we take care of someone who's suffering that much or who's that disconnected from the reality the rest of us share? Then I think, you know, we just see that as a shared responsibility for the minority of people who still need to be caught up in that, instead of putting personal responsibility on everybody to like pay their debt back. Do you have any thoughts on that, Erin, before I get to the other comments?
Well, actually, I got distracted by Antonia's comment about the Tupac syndrome, which.
Oh yeah, do you want to bounce off that then, please?
Yeah, it says you can take the boy out of the hood, but you can't take the hood out of the boy. Oh, sorry. Could you hear me? Because I wasn't speaking into the mic. It says you can take the boy out of the hood, but you can't take the hood out of the boy. And I think that is first of all, as a lyric, you know, like that speaking to someone's culture is very different than what we mean by this idea that like people somehow are going to be criminally, what we consider to be criminal behavior. And again, I get back to what I said before, like what do we categorize as criminal behavior? And the hood is a place that has been depleted of resources. Mm-hmm. And when people grow up in that environment, it is very much a part of them. But that is something that society created. It's not on an individual, like, personal inside, like that they're going to be some kind of criminal.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think of that lyric as more expressing what it means to be living with trauma, you know?
Right.
I don't think it's speaking to, like, oh, you know, you can remove someone from this context, but they're still going to be, like, a bad person or something. I think it means that, like, even when your situation changes, you're still living with the legacy of that trauma that you endured. And when we think about what the quote-unquote hood is, like you said, it is under-resourced places. These like is that a cat?
Sorry, cricket's joining us.
Then yeah, you know, we're talking about folks who are. Sorry, I got very distracted by the cat.
He's beautiful. I understand.
I mean, so like, what's interesting, I don't know what it's like to grow up Black at all. And the neighborhood I grew up in probably wouldn't have been called the hood because it was still like mostly white people. This was in Massachusetts, but I grew up in public housing, and it was pretty abysmal conditions actually. Like there was a class action lawsuit and stuff because our water was brown and there was mold in the cabinets, and it was like a pretty rough situation. And I was surrounded by a lot of like instability and people who were addicted to things, and there was a lot of like crime and stuff like that, and people in and out of jail and prison. When I grew up, and like, so the way I kind of relate to that lyric is that like I carry that. Antonia's saying yes, it is the hood or the person. We carry our culture and communities with us. So I guess, you know, if we're going to get into this philosophical debate, I agree. Like we carry our culture with us. We're the products of our context. Like it's not generally, I think, an individual failing that people end up in situations where they're quote unquote committing crimes, you know? as well as like violence by and large is a learned behavior, you know. And I think it's important for us as like white people, you know, me as like a white person who grew up in a public housing unstable setting, but have also had the privileges of like not being targeted the way like black people in that same kind of setting would be then and to this day. I think it's important for us to think about, for us to think about violence as not just like someone punching someone else or assaulting someone else, but there's like systemic violence, and there are some very, very normalized ways that our society is violent. The most horrific of which I think are war and some of the imperial things that we do globally, and then the prison system domestically, and the way that the police and court and jail and prison systems all kind of collaborate to lock people in cages and do things that like we would essentially consider torture, confining people and restricting their access to each other and resources.
Yeah, exactly. And again, when we think about crime, I think people are thinking about people committing some kind of harm, right?
Yeah.
But how do we measure that? And most often we're punishing people. Well, for one thing, we punish people for things that have pretty much zero harm at all, which is like marijuana, which could get us into a marijuana decrim if you want to in a minute.
Sure.
But also, again, like, how are we categorizing what is a crime? How are we thinking about what it means to harm? How are we categorizing what keeps people safe? Because I would say I don't feel very safe with a lot of CEOs and bankers.
Yeah.
And these people have done massive harm on a scale far larger than some kid who tries to hold up a convenience store.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and in a lot of ways, the reason why people are holding up a convenience store is because of the context created by those people who are holding buildings. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I guess that speaks to, when we talk about systems of violence, it's important to talk about white supremacy, to talk about racialized violence, and that we're not so removed from the KKK and slavery and Jim Crow and these things that created the society we're a part of and created the legal system that we still base all of our decisions around precedent from,
That's great.
That the idea of property ownership in the first place is derived from a group of folks who came here and settled land that people were already living on, and that those people didn't believe you could own it, but the people who came over on ships with big guns believed you could, and they, forcibly murdered or assimilated everyone who was already here. And since then, they treated large numbers of human beings as property, which they used to then create a vast amount of wealth and an empire that we still benefit from to this day, being fairly insulated from a lot of harm, like societally in the world, and that all that is built off of these like layers of exploitation and violence that have created ideas of race and then used that to keep people pitted against each other at the benefit of essentially like a wealthy property-owning class that historically was just white men, and now can include people who might look different, but is still derivative of that same problem. And just the logic has shifted from God and race to be about wealth and entitlement.
I like that.
Yeah. We've gotten very abstracted here. How that plays out with the drug war and on the local policy level is that people are very disproportionately policed and arrested. So it's not just about the law that's on the books. It's about how it's enforced. And so we know, again, investigative journalism was required to do this. We know that our own police department in Clarke County is disproportionately arresting black people for the same quote-unquote crime that I think you and I, Erin, would agree isn't a crime, of marijuana possession. And that the national statistics are that you are, 4 times as likely to be, or like 3.8 times as likely to be arrested if you're black than if you're white. In Clarke County, it's actually higher than that. So we're actually not only disproportionately arresting black people in Clarke County, but even worse than the national average. So, again, when I think of that myth of this being this like progressive liberal community, it depends on what aspect of our community you're looking at. Certainly if you're looking at the way we police drugs and who we're locking up in this jail and prison system and using the labor.
And the poverty rate.
Yeah. What?
I said, and the poverty rate isn't unrelated.
Not unrelated at all. Yeah, exactly. So we're getting a lot from Antonio. If others want to chime in with questions or comments, please ask them. And I think you have some from some A3 members too, right, Erin?
I had one from Carrie Ritzler.
Okay.
Or is it Reichler? I'm so sorry if I'm saying that wrong.
I believe it's Carrie Ritzler. I'll take this last question from Antonio before we go to that. Does that sound good?
Yeah, go for it.
Antonio says, you just mentioned the major split, violent versus nonviolent. Also see uniform crime reports from the Department of Justice each year. Gives a lot of details and problems of reporting or misunderstandings. Oh, okay. So that's it. Antonio, if you have a link to that, if you could link that in the chat, that would be awesome. I'd love to read whatever suggestions you have on how to advance or better understand what we're talking about. Did you have something from Carrie, Erin?
Yes. So this is going to take us on a bit of a shift. Although, again, most of these things are not unrelated from each other because everything is interconnected in the systems we live in.
Mm-hmm.
Carrie asks, in May 2019, the city committed to 100% clean and renewable energy by 2035. As commissioner, what would you, Jesse Houle, do to support the city in meeting this goal? She didn't say Jesse Houle, I did.
Okay. Well, for anybody who wants to check out the website, if you haven't already, our platform's on there, and we talk about a Green New Deal in Athens. So many of you are probably familiar with this idea of the Green New Deal. I've been really excited about it ever since Jill Stein ran on it in 2012 for the Green Party. And that was actually the entire Green Party's platform, was the Green New Deal. And since then, they ran on it in 2012 and 2016, and then it's been taken up by the progressive and democratic socialist wing of the Democratic Party. So people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders are pushing for the Green New Deal on the federal level through the more well-established Democratic Party. And it looks similar to the Green Party's proposal. Actually, the Green Party's proposal goes a bit farther, so actually I like it even more. But the basic idea is much like FDR's New Deal. You create a massive public works project that employs people at a living wage, or what folks like Richard Winfield would call a fair wage, so like $20 an hour. You pay them to build infrastructure or other things that are for the public good. And with the Green New Deal, we're focusing explicitly on sustainable infrastructure. So the climate crisis is real. This whole coronavirus situation is kind of like a short timeline dress rehearsal, I think, for what's happening globally with climate change. And I think we can extrapolate some lessons about how we respond now to how we can deal with, reckon with the climate change that we're already stuck with, as well as try to mitigate the harm. The equivalent of sheltering in place for our society might look a lot like slowing down and not using as many airplanes. But a lot of that involves also trying to figure out how to transform society, as peacefully as possible, hopefully, into a place that's still desirable to live. We still have clean water and food abundance and medical abundance. Hopefully we're distributing that more equitably, but we're also producing all of it sustainably, so that there's still a planet to live on in 100 years. And I'm really proud of the local government for passing that 100% resolution. Has a lot of really great stuff in it that's in line with the Green New Deal in terms of a fairly aggressive timeline, as well as a commitment to 100% renewable energy, that we know that half measures aren't enough, as well as a lot of language about equity and really focusing on building that infrastructure by, for, and with vulnerable populations, people who are what we might call like marginalized or whatever, but really looking at the parts of Athens-Clarke County where folks are most low wealth and low income, where there are more renters, where there is a higher poverty rate, where people are getting out of jail more recently and things like that. And saying like, okay, well, how do we build infrastructure up for them first? Because that's how we have community uplift, at a base level. And that resolution is really, really wonderful in its language, and it is only a resolution. It does not formally obligate the county government to do anything. And so what it's going to take is political will to see that resolution through in its best and fullest form, and to hopefully go even beyond what that resolution stipulates. So when we're talking about environmental sustainability and we're talking about equity, and especially like racial equity, that we have people who are making decisions year after year who hold center the things we most need for transforming our economy and transforming our community away from this increasingly and exceedingly unequal economic state that is very racist, and towards something that is more equitable, that the distribution is more equitable, that our economy is really working for everyone, that we're having an honest conversation about race while we do it, that we're prioritizing hiring and serving people of color, and especially Black Athenians, and that we're doing as much as possible to build the city's infrastructure in line with having a sustainable plan. And so public transit is a great option for that, moving to a fare, free public transit system that serves everyone more equitably and operates in a more environmentally friendly way. We're pretty well on the path to that already. I look at things like ending the practice of unpaid labor as in line with this, because a lot of the jobs that those folks do are things like stormwater treatment. And what we really need to see is better infrastructure to protect our wetlands and our waterways and things like that. And that infrastructure is largely people doing labor. And I think that it's important that we pay people a living wage, a fair wage, to do that labor. And I think that it's a great idea to hire people who are currently already living in Athens-Clarke County and who most need a job. And when we look at the poverty rate and we look at how racialized that is, what it basically comes down to is like, we need to hire Black and brown folks at a wage way above what most people are getting paid to do this work that we all need to still have a community and a planet to live on.
Exactly.
That's my. If you have any more questions about that, I'd love to elaborate, but I already just talked a lot.
Yeah. I forget that I have to talk into this. Okay. I think actually that kind of makes me think about like what a good idea a kind of Green New Deal perspective, especially on jobs and labor, could be, because you have the need for these jobs, and you can get kind of more push for these jobs from the, I would say, like, more middle and upper white class of people, because those people tend to be like very focused on this issue. And I hear a lot of kind of divides sometimes when it comes to discussing environmental issues being different than talking about racial equity, when in fact they're not. They're interrelated. But I understand the want to look at those things differently. For some people who would rather just like focus on talking about racial equity, and I totally get that. But to my mind, for one thing, if you have a kind of white upper class that tends to get their wants met more often, if you have them desiring to have environmental jobs and things like that in Athens, or they want let's say solar panels installed, then we can be like, great, the workforce to do that will be, all of these folks who need good jobs, and they're going to be paid really well to do it, and we'll provide training for them, and it could be such a good jobs program.
Totally.
To my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Clarke County government needs to start doing a better job of hiring and paying people than the poultry plant. Like, that shouldn't be hard to do, And like, I can't imagine someone wouldn't rather work on like maintaining wetlands or stormwater or installing solar panels. I can't imagine that those jobs are less desirable for people than working in the poultry plant. Except that the poultry plant is a place where you have a job today and you'll have it tomorrow, and they actually pay you better than most other jobs in town, because most jobs in town pay crap. And so, like, the Clarke County government has an opportunity to pay an actually good wage, and I totally agree. Like, let's aggressively hire people to do this work, and really focus on hiring people of color. And then I think the conversation shifts very naturally and immediately to people, including people of color, seeing that like as a good job. Like, ultimately, what people want is a job that's going to help them pay the bills, and ideally, like, pay you enough that you have some free time to use that money you earned to do more than just pay the bills. And yeah, the Green New Deal is like this really wonderful holistic plan to do that. It takes that tension that we see of environmental justice and racial justice and says, well, we can actually have both and, because the truth is, if there's a climate crisis, which we're already in, all the crises that we've normalized, this is a lot of what I've been talking about coronavirus, is like, hopefully you look at this crisis as an opportunity to not only respond to it in a healthy and compassionate way, but to lay the groundwork for an alternative way of going about things from here on out that acknowledges and redresses the crises we've gotten used to. Because
yes.
Someone who loses a job is in a crisis. Someone who's suffering from a physical or mental health breakdown is in a crisis, and millions of people are living with those crises every day before coronavirus ever came along. What coronavirus does is exacerbate it for everyone, including those folks. And so if we look at society as having this crisis of white supremacy, and this crisis of poverty and inequality, and this crisis of incarcerating millions of people, and that we're doing that primarily to Black people, then any other crisis we throw on top of it, whether it's coronavirus now or climate change now and more so later, those crises are just going to layer on. And the people who are going to be most affected by a food shortage, people who are going to be most affected by hospital closures, they're going to be most affected by flooding and natural disasters, and most vulnerable from being able to recover, are going to be those people who are living in poverty, are going to be those people who are already lacking access to resources to begin with. So in my mind, it's like very common sense to marry the two and say that like we have to transform our society to not produce an even worse climate crisis, and the people to focus on doing that with first are the people who are already suffering crises on a regular basis now. No one knows better how to navigate a given situation than someone who's living it. So if we want to solve our collective global human crisis, maybe we should work primarily with people who are already dealing with other crises.
Yeah, I couldn't have said that better. I'm recognizing now that we've been on for almost 45 minutes, a little over. And we said we would do this from noon to 1, but we got all sidetracked because Facebook sucks. Not that I'm not grateful for it functioning sort of now.
In the words of Facebook, it's complicated.
It is complicated. Yeah. That's fair. But, I'm happy to keep going, but if you want to keep it to about an hour like we said we would, we can move on to some other topics.
Yeah, I'm happy to keep chatting for a while. Ultimately, I see this as an opportunity for anyone who's watching to get me on the record, you know, so hopefully I'm on the commission in 2021, and then you can hold me to account to all the stuff I'm saying now. And also an opportunity, I think, even more importantly, because I feel pretty confident that I only say things I mean, and I'm going to follow through on what I say to the best of my ability. But really, I see this as an opportunity to keep knocking heads together. And you know, normally I'd love to have events and roundtables with people in person, but since we can't do that right now, being able to talk with you and anybody else who wants to chime in, please chime in. You know, we can do that. But at the very least, even if it's just you and me for a bit longer, Erin, you know, it'll provide fodder for future conversations with people, because this can hopefully be clarifying. So, I mean, y'all had a big old questionnaire, and I rushed through my responses to it, so there's plenty of room for clarification and elaboration on that, I think. Also, a belated goodbye to Antonio. If you watch this again later, the rest of it, Antonio, thanks for tuning into all these and participating.
Yeah, thanks for chatting with us. And Chris, thanks, Chris, for chatting. I don't know if you left or...
I like that Antonio drops comments that you're like, I'm not sure if this is like an alt-right troll right now, or like it's very like open-ended, you know, like, what do you think about this Tupac lyric? And then
yeah, it did give me pause for a moment, but I was like, no, this is fair. Yeah, this is good. Let's riff off of it.
In my experience, Antonio is good people.
Well, that's good.
And a very thoughtful thinker. Hey, Chris. Chris is still here listening. Chris,
Yay,
if you have any questions or thoughts, please ask. And then I think I saw Farah here. There are definitely people watching, so please, you know, pipe up.
If there's anyone watching or watching later who doesn't know Jesse very well or doesn't know Chris very well, I will do a little plug for Athens Politics Nerds. Jesse has an interview on Athens Politics Nerds that you should definitely check out. Also, there's interviews with several other candidates on there, so check it out.
Yeah, I'll pull up the link.
Thank you. I'm also going to look at your questionnaire answers on Athens for Everyone's website, which people can also look up. We send questionnaires to all the candidates running for commission, running for sheriff, I think, and running for school board. Now, not everybody has gotten those answers back to us yet, and not everyone will, presumably, but those who do or have, we post them up on the website. So you can check that out at athensforeveryone.com.
Oh, hi, Audie. Audie's listening while gardening. Yay.
Hi, Audie. Oh, that's so cool.
I do love how much gardening is occurring right now for everyone.
It's pretty cool. It's nice. And I hear it. And that way we're all out in our yards. This is what's happened to me in my neighborhood. So, like, I'm out in my yard and so are my neighbors doing the talking, and it's beautiful. I love it. Maybe I'll turn around. I also had too much coffee, so I'm like, and I feel like my thoughts are going. So I'm glad that you're here, Jesse, because you're quite an articulate speaker on the fly.
Well, thanks. Yeah. I try to be. I guess I'm sort of signing up to try to do that job, so hopefully folks agree.
Yeah. yeah, I can say you'd be good at that job.
Audie says it's literally vital. You know, there's a bit of a lag between, I think, when people hear what we're saying and when they and when we said it. I'm not sure, Audie, if you mean plants, but I'm assuming you mean that gardening is literally vital. And isn't that wonderful? Isn't that cool?
Isn't that cool? Oh, since Audie is listening, perhaps we could talk a little bit about protecting undocumented folks.
Sure, yeah. And I'll link to this questionnaire too.
Thank you.
All right. I'll link straight to mine. So here we go. I'm trying to get better at my tags, but I'm still not very swift with it. So it's like always learning. Always learning.
You'll get there. You'll get there. While you're doing that, actually, I can, for people, like you sort of talked a little bit about undocumented folks in the questionnaire, because we had a question that says, do you support DIA and AIRC, which is Athens Immigrant Rights Coalition, in their efforts to protect undocumented people? And you said, yes. And then you elaborated, which is great because not everybody did that. Some people literally just put yes or no, which I get. A lot of people are busy. Thank you for elaborating. You said, I'm proud to have stood alongside DIA and AIRC in countless marches, demonstrations, and advocacy efforts, and will continue to stand with them against ICE, the Board of Regents, and any other institution that seeks to marginalize and dehumanize people through racist and violent policies. Migration is beautiful. No human is illegal. In my view, anyone in local government has a duty to support the dignity and security of everyone who resides here. That's very well put.
Well, thanks. Yeah, that's. I guess that sums it up. I'm happy to elaborate if people want to ask me specific questions about what that looks like or how. I will say, in short, that I guess I've known folks who have been doing work in the immigrant community ever since Occupy Wall Street. So that's when I first got involved, and I first met Beto and Noe Mendoza. And what I love about DIA and how it's grown over the years is that it's really organized by people who are exactly who the organization exists to support. And that's the best kind of organizing, right? Is people define for themselves what the needs are, what the priorities are, what healing looks like, what support looks like. And yeah, Audie's mentioning rapid response. Audie, please do share that link when you get it. So there's a rapid response network. When ICE comes to our community, they often come without warning, and as we know, kidnap people from their homes or their workplace or somewhere in transit between their home and wherever they're going, and put those people through a series of pretty horrific experiences, locked in cages and brought to places often undisclosed. Folks don't know where to find their family member once they're taken a lot of the time. And then, of course, are frequently deported to another country that they fled, sometimes out of a great amount of fear. Sometimes it's to come here for just seeking a place that's different or that they feel might be better, for economic reasons or whatever reasons they may have. But a lot of times people are also fleeing violence that can play out in particularly horrific ways. I don't need to spend my time right now talking about my time traveling around Latin America, but I will say that in the time I spent in Latin America, being able to meet a lot of people there firsthand, I gained a real appreciation for how difficult it is to get here, how easy it is for folks in the United States to travel almost anywhere, for the combined reasons of our passports being recognized and we're welcome there, as well as the fact that our dollar is stronger, and so you can go to most other countries and pay the same amount or usually less to get whatever it is we're accustomed to getting here, even the basics like food. Whereas someone who's in Guatemala is going to have a really hard time using their money in Guatemala to even get here, never mind afford anything once they're here. And that economic relationship on an international level is the result of, centuries of colonialism and imperialism and more recently trade agreements that have set up the United States to have an exploitative relationship with other parts of the world, including and in many ways especially Latin America. And when I think about what it means to stand in community with other human beings, I really think of it as just any other person, regardless of where they're from. And if someone's choosing to live here, then they're from here, in my opinion, because this is what they're choosing to make a home out of. And they're no less a resident than a student who's here for 2 years, they're no less a resident than I was when I first moved here from Massachusetts, and I don't think that they're any more or less entitled than we are to be here, because the lines that are drawn that give us birthright or whatever are arbitrarily drawn by people who don't have human interests in mind, or didn't, when they were drawn.
Yeah.
Audie says, having just come back from Cuba, it's rough.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it's just there's so much to do to try to change the world to be a better version of what it currently is, a more compassionate society or whatever. And I get a lot of times caught up in wondering, well, what the hell can we really do about NAFTA, But in Athens, what we can do is get behind DIA, and we can work with the Athens Immigrant Rights Coalition, and we can show up in the ways that they're asking us to. And so part of that means advocating for licenses for undocumented folks, and doing what other states have done in giving people driver's licenses. Part of that is getting involved in this rapid response network, which is, fairly easy. I'm looking forward to Audie posting the link so people can know how to sign up. But basically, you get a text alert when ICE is spotted, or when someone thinks ICE is spotted. There's a lot of fear in the community. It's hard sometimes to know, especially because you're trying to get the hell away, whether that unmarked police vehicle is ICE or FBI or something, right? And so usually there's kind of two waves of response. The first is someone goes out to confirm that the cited vehicle or officers or agents or whatever are actually ICE. And then if they are, they begin filming and call upon other people to show up as well, so that at least these kidnappings that are occurring in our community can be documented, but also by playing that role of legal observer. And these groups, Athens Immigrant Rights Coalition and Dignidad Migrante in Athens, have trainings and stuff where people can learn how to do the legal observer things, keep yourself safe while trying to help keep others as safe as possible in these really kind of frightening situations. But yeah, providing that legal observer framework can both ensure that interaction goes better than it might if no one is watching, and also create some amount of accountability, so that these folks have more legal recourse than they would have otherwise. And sometimes that might mean saving a deportation. At the least, it might mean saving someone from deportation. But at the least, it can help that person and their family have a better understanding of what's happening, to move forward with at least information, because it's so hard to get information. And I think what the local government needs to do is follow up on another great resolution they passed last year, which was in support of the immigrant community, with as many substantive policies as possible, or just keep pumping out the resolutions. What's to stop the county government from continually using the platform that our mayor and commission has to broadcast to the broader community outside Athens and outside and all around Georgia, and ideally more effectively get to the rest of the country that, hey, in the South, there are people that care about each other regardless of our documentation status, and that this institution that's elected by people who do have documentation wants to include the people who don't. And here's the ways that we think it needs to happen. Hey, state government, put in place the licensing policy. Hey, federal government, we need a path to immigration that is just and compassionate. And on the local level, we can at least keep doing as much mitigating as possible. And a lot of that comes down to how we interact with our police department and how the local government instructs the police department to interact with the community. And again, we go back to the idea of treating policing as social work. There isn't an incentive to be trying to generate revenue from fining people. If there isn't an incentive to put people in a jail or a prison to get their free labor, then I think we stop seeing a lot of these folks getting arrested in the first place. If they don't get arrested, then they're not caught up in a database where ICE can then pull their information and know where to find them. Because that's when the first domino of arrest falls. ICE has access to those databases. Whether we are a community in very defiant resistance or not, the police arresting someone puts their information in a database. ICE has access to that database, and there's no way for the local government to cut off that access. So when we talk about non-cooperation with ICE, what that really just means is local law enforcement like helping ICE do the raids. Our local law enforcement is already not doing that, and is local law enforcement honoring requests from ICE to hold people longer than they would otherwise. ICE will say like, hey, we want to come steal this person from your community. Can you hold on to them in that facility for an extra couple days while we get there? And so when you hear about non-cooperation, this debate for the sheriff's race between John Q, who I'm really excited about, and the other two candidates, is that John Q wants to not cooperate with ICE. And what that means is not doing these voluntary holds. But I think it's really important to recognize that only is part of the problem. There is still this information sharing, and that occurs as soon as there's a police interaction. So what we need to do is try to rethink our policing so that those interactions aren't happening and those arrests aren't happening in the first place. Sorry, that was a very long. I guess this is what we're here for, is to hear me talk. I'm really self-conscious about how much monologue.
Had this been more intended for me to talk more, I would have prepped. But I'm enjoying listening to what you're saying. I don't know. I was actually, this just popped into my brain, was I saw an article about ICE getting information from the EMD, and I don't know where necessarily that was, or if anyone else knows more about that. But that was something that I've seen recently. Did you see that, Jesse?
I did not. So I would be glad to read anything that you or anyone else has about any new cooperation ICE is trying to get with institutions, or where they're pulling their information from. One thing that's worth noting is that ICE is not entitled to do roadblocks in our community, and they're announcing they'll tell the Clarke County government when they're coming. They tell the police department, and so right now I'm really encouraged that we have some meaningful allies on the commission who have set up a process where, with the chief, so I'm also grateful for the current chief for being involved in this, where when the chief hears from ICE that they're coming, which is usually between 30 minutes and 2 hours from when they'll actually be here. When the chief hears that, he'll tell these commissioners, and then these commissioners are going to share that information with the Athens Immigrant Rights Coalition. So that's part of how we hope to, moving forward, get a better jump on this rapid response team, so that we have people showing up to do the legal observer thing in time, and with hopefully also more accurate information on where to go. I'd also love to see our local government and police department do everything we can to get ICE the hell out of here. I would love to have a conversation with the chief, if I'm able to, alongside other commissioners, about how can our police show up on behalf of the community to be the legal observers. How can the police show up to be the checkpoint for ICE's checkpoint? There's a lot. I feel very wary in a lot of ways of police for a lot of reasons. But we do have. What's that?
I said, I was surprised to hear you say that.
What we have ultimately are a lot of people on staff paid by the county to do a job right now, and what I'm advocating for is for that job to look very different, and for it to be in service of a very different thing. I think one way that can look is, if the police chief is willing to help sound the alarm that ICE is on the way, how can we take that further to get in ICE's way?
Yeah, that's a good point. Does anybody else have any more questions for Jesse about protecting undocumented folks?
It'll probably take about a minute for people to hear you ask that. Yeah. I'm also all ears. Mostly what I try to do, to go back to that question, is try to follow DIA and AIRC's lead, especially DIA's lead on what we need to do. So if we don't want even more cops on the scene, I could see a lot of reasons why we don't want that. Then, no reason to try to push for that.
Right. Yeah. That's pretty much also how, Athens for Everyone has put it. We're following the lead of these organizations that are led by the people who are actually, really affected by these things. So DIA and the AIRC are some of the best resources we have in Athens in protecting immigrant and undocumented families and people.
I think, one thing I'll say while we're kind of lagging here is when I talk about rethinking policing as social work, one encouraging part of our police department is the crisis intervention response units. So for a few years, that was just one police officer, Officer Robbie, who would go with the social worker. And they'd arrive on the scene of what would be described as like mental health crises. And Robbie prided himself on never having arrested anyone, prided himself on never having pulled his gun out. That's what I want policing to look like, is people who show up in situations trying to help someone find a way forward that's safe for them and that doesn't involve arresting them or pulling their gun on them. I don't think police are going anywhere anytime soon, but I think that we can change how they operate. And so what I would love to see is our police department transition into most of the officers functioning like our crisis intervention response units currently do. So, we saw the commission last year double the amount of crisis intervention response units we have, which meant we go from 1 to 2. I think we need to go from 2 to more than 50%. I'd ideally like to think of it as like 100% of our police department functions that way.
Right.
Maybe there's some special team that's only called upon in an active shooter crisis scenario that we hopefully don't run into but should be prepared for. And otherwise, the day-to-day operations of the police department looks very different and much more compassionate. Audie says the best link they can offer is the event which was canceled. I think that link is still great, so please, if you can share that link and it gets people connected where they need to. I guess we can also just link to the DIA and AIRC website, right?
Yeah, we can do that. I can do that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have another question for me? You want to switch topics to something else on the questionnaire?
There was. Yeah, we can do a questionnaire. There was one other topic that I had written down that I was wanting us to talk about, which is housing, your housing policy ideas, and to have you talk about land banking, because I don't know a whole lot about that.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I still have a lot to learn about that as well. But I learned about it because kind of the magical thing about choosing to run for commission is that more people want to talk to me about more stuff. And so I keep learning about things that, even though I've tried to work for housing justice for a bunch of years, I didn't know about. And I had a really great conversation with Ted Terry, the mayor of Clarkston, former mayor of Clarkston, the most diverse square mile in the U.S. or whatever, now running for the DeKalb County Commission. And we talked a lot about, at first, some of the policies that they were able to pass in Clarkston that were really exciting, around like marijuana decriminalization, which we still need here, living wage policies, etc. And then I said, well, I don't know how much you've run into housing issues there and how much that I kind of described the situation here, which he's pretty familiar with. But do you have any thoughts on that? And he gave me this litany of ideas, and many of them have already been enacted somewhere in Georgia. And so that really opened to me the door. Like this conversation we hear about what we can do for affordable housing isn't as including everything. You know, when we're told, well, we can't do that, that's actually an incomplete answer. You know, when someone says we need rent control, and we're told, well, we can't do that, maybe we can't do rent control the way other cities in the country have done rent control. Maybe when we talk about a tenant's bill of rights, it won't look the same way it does in Montreal or, you know, in New York. But we can still have something that looks similar and that accomplishes a similar goal. And then when we talk about affordable housing policy and how to, you know, we talk about a transformed economy, how do we have a housing market in town that is transformed in some way to safeguard against displacement and gentrification and these kind of big concepts that are hard to wrestle with. Land banking is one of the really exciting prospects, I think. My understanding is that the county can, you know, the county can purchase land. The county already owns some land. And so we create a land bank, similar in function to how the land trust, the Athens Land Trust is set up, but this is run by the county instead of by another nonprofit entity. And then when you either develop that land and sell the development, or you sell that land to a developer, your negotiating power is greatly expanded from what it would be otherwise. So, you know, if I've never owned property, but let's pretend for a second that I'm a property owner and I want to sell my land that I've now somehow afforded to purchase to someone else. The county government is very limited in how it can regulate that sale. And then if the person I sell it to wants to develop it, the county is limited in how it can regulate what that development looks like. So there are regulations we can put in place that can lead to smarter development and redevelopment. And there's already like a lot, like there are a lot of regulations in place to navigate. Some of that complicatedness I think actually makes a lot of sense and is good. Some of it can probably be cleaned up and run a little better. But land banking allows the county government to basically, like, you acquire land, hopefully the attractive land that you think would be desirable, and then you sell it to a developer. Someone else spends the money developing it, and you're able to mandate what that development looks like by building it into your contract. So we're currently limited in how we can define affordable housing. If a private developer like the Mark sells their giant building they were able to build to someone else, that someone else can do basically whatever the hell they want with it, as long as it's in line with our existing regulations around a development that already exists of that size. But if the county government were to own the Armstrong-Dobbs tract on which that was built, right, and then sell it to a developer through a land banking program, or sell it to people individually through a land banking program, however that would look, then the county government could define much more strictly like what that development could look like. So in terms of environmental sustainability, we could regulate things to be even more sustainable than the current 100% resolution is indicating. And in terms of affordable housing units and what that affordable housing has to look like, what percentage of it needs to be affordable, how we define what affordable is. There's a lot more flexibility for the county government to be as progressive, as, you know, transformative as we would like. And so, I mean, maybe that was, I don't know if I just over-explained that or still explained it too vaguely because I'm kind of learning it myself. But
Okay.
does that kind of make sense? Like,
Yeah, I think I'm grasping that better than I did before.
What I'm really excited about, I've talked to a couple people about land banking since, and they were like, oh yeah, land banking, great way to set up expectations and agreements, but there's still the question of enforcement. You know, so then we get into the question of how do you hold people accountable to the standards that we set up in these agreements, and that does open another can of worms of what does that accountability mechanism look like. So if we sign an agreement around affordable housing with someone who, you know, is negotiating a contract with us, the property we have in a land bank, then how do we actually make sure that they're adhering to that not only in the way they build the structure, which is a bit easier because you have like the building inspector to do that and be like, oh no, you need better weatherization in your walls, right? But then once that development's been there for 5 years, how are you actually making sure that they're still keeping the prices affordable?
That's it. Issues that have to be dealt with.
Yeah.
Catherine Titus has joined us, and she seems in favor of land banking.
Yay! That's one. We just need to get that critical mass. We're on our way.
I think unless you have more you want to add to talking about housing policy.
No, I mean I got to talk about it quite a bit with Mariah in the last kitchen table chat too. So if people want to learn more about the tenants' bill of rights, we talked about that.
Yeah, I think because, well, speaking of housing and things like that, that kind of segues into something that is on my mind a lot is the renters' strike, the rent strike. And curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I saw a letter being circulated by an apartment manager that I don't know if it was a management company or the manager of the and it wasn't an apartment sector, I think it was a trailer park. But I don't want to call out their name because I'm not sure if that leaves me somehow liable. But included in it was this line of like, you've got to pay your rents. People who don't pay their rent are gonna face eviction. Of course, there's a moratorium right now, so no one can be evicted right now. But as soon as the moratorium on eviction hearings is lifted, people could be evicted down the road for what happens now. And then they said, like, we need you to pay your rent so that we can continue to operate things as like normal. And my emotional immediate response in a comment to that was anyone who's including in their letter that we need to keep operating like normal right now can eat it.
Because of these normal times.
Yeah. So again, this comes down to like, what do we hold center, and who's most vulnerable is who I try to hold center, and I think renters are the most vulnerable right now. Anyone who owns property or manages property has mechanisms in place that empower them. Not only is that property worth something and they can use that value now and down the road, but that property also is insured, and there are more rights that exist for people who own property and things. That's not the case for tenants. And usually if you're a tenant, that's also because you have less wealth in general. Your income's probably less stable. Not always, but usually for people who are renting. So right now, in these times, since we haven't gotten checks from the government yet, since there isn't any kind of federal policy in place waiving people's rent or helping them pay for it, I totally encourage people to not pay their rent. And hopefully we develop a critical mass of people doing that so that there is kind of a forced change that occurs where people aren't being expected to pay rent right now as if they have the income that everyone did have, but most people don't now. And Audie's asking if we can post a link about the moratorium on evictions. So I don't have a link to that yet. What I know about it...
There might be one in the COVID group.
Yeah. You can check out the mutual aid network. There's also, I think it's called Athens or Athena Ekerts, which is strike spelled backwards, is like a Facebook group. And then there's like a Rent Strike Athens Facebook group. And they've got some really great resources, including a sample letter people can send to their landlord or property manager. The moratorium that currently exists is something that the courts have set up. That's not, the mayor and commission didn't set it up. The mayor and some commissioners have been having conversations with judges, I think primarily Judge Barron, who, as I understand it, is the one who would oversee any eviction hearings. And I think it's this like superior court judge, or I'm less familiar with court structure, but one of the higher level, maybe the highest level judge is the one who had to give okay on postponing hearings about evictions. And so through the court system, with Judge Barron being on board with this, there is a moratorium on holding those hearings until the end of April. So one of the things I spoke with Mariah Parker about, and as far as I understand it, they're still looking into if the mayor and commission has the power to extend that moratorium, or if it has to come through the courts. But Mariah thinks it probably has to come through the courts, and also if the shelter-in-place policy gets extended and or other things around this continue to get worse, or hopefully people's health situation, the hospital doesn't get worse, but maybe the economy continues to be chaos because most of us are sheltering in place, then it seems likely that they can extend that further. But all that is a moratorium on holding the hearing. There isn't currently anything in place to prevent someone from filing for eviction and then having their hearing down the road. So in my mind, the best way to prevent that from happening is for a critical mass of people to not pay their rent in April because they can't, and then eviction, it'll overwhelm the system, and it won't make sense to evict thousands of people all at once, because then they'll all essentially just move out of where they currently are into the home of someone else who got evicted. It wouldn't make any sense. So I think, if we hit a critical mass of people who skip the rent in April because they can't pay it, that puts pressure on the system higher up to make a change. And ideally, I think that change is some kind of waiver, or maybe from the federal government, a voucher to make up for it. So instead of people who are broke trying to pool their resources to pay each other's rent, the billionaires that should be paying for this all along can foot the bill through the government, taxing them and then using that money to pay people's rent for a couple months. That's the ideal outcome, but we have no idea how this plays out, obviously, right? So there is a risk involved, obviously. And I think on the local level in Athens, that risk is mitigated by as many people as possible participating and supporting each other, so that the people who are most vulnerable are not just doing this alone. Because there's going to be some people who won't pay the rent regardless because they absolutely can't. And then there's going to be some people who won't pay the rent unless they get rent assistance that they for some reason have access to, and on and on. And so I think if everybody who right now is like, I don't know how to pay the rent, maybe it's a good idea to figure out how to build some solidarity, including with landlords and property management companies, to kind of waive the rent, postpone the rent itself rather than just postponing the eviction hearings.
Yeah.
I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? I thought you looked like you were clicking a lot, so I kept trying to talk, but I thought you were looking for links.
No, I got distracted by another conversation. But I mean, yeah, I basically, to me, and I posted about this on my Facebook. I see renters as a vulnerable group. Most people who are renting are renting because they wouldn't be able to afford to buy property, and so that puts them at a significant kind of risk. And I see property owners and people who are property owners and acting as landlords complaining about this idea. They're like, no, don't pass along the harm and the risk. Well, they didn't say risk. I'm thinking risk. But to me, that's actually something that people with privilege should be doing, and it is a privilege to be able to afford to have properties. There's a lot more risk in having properties in certain ways, as far as whether or not you can pay for those things or keep them, or what happens to your credit and things like that I understand are valid concerns, because hardly own a house, and I get it. But at the same time, people who are at risk of literally not having somewhere to live is far more important to me. And so taking on the risk of like whatever the backlash might be of, having less money coming in from your renters all of a sudden is something that we should be doing as a privileged class of the people who own property. It's our responsibility to take on that risk. And to my mind, if there is a giant rent strike, it's very likely that there will be some kind of leniency from lenders to the landlord class, like, because they tend to favor us.
Yeah, the avenues for recourse there are gonna be more avenues for recourse, and there's gonna be more recognition in general for people who own property than people who are just renting. So I think
exactly
whatever relief package comes down the road is much more likely to happen for property owners, and especially large property owning and property managing companies, than for whoever's renting. And so you said take on the risk. I think of it as sharing the risk, right? It's not
right.
like the landlord takes it on all by themselves. It's just that for once they're sharing a little bit of that risk with the people who rent from them. And generally the people who are doing the renting are in the riskier, more precarious situation along. There's a power dynamic there that favors the person who owns the property. I think one of the most promising things that can come out of a crisis like this, as jarring and difficult as it is for people to recognize solidarity and to see each other's humanity across class, and for people who are a landlord to actually recognize the humanity of their renters and say, I'm with you, instead of just having the agreement in place, the contract that's more about like using each other's resources rather than really standing with each other's humanity.
Right. And Catherine brings up a good point, I think. She says small-time landlords should be less heavily regulated than large rental management firms. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that, like so many things, as I delve deeper and deeper into this being the candidate, I learn how complicated it is to actually write policies that do what we want them to do. So I totally agree that, like, in like progressive taxation structures and progressive fee structures, and some of the most commonly used ones, like around the progressive property tax, are preempted in Georgia by state laws that don't let us do what we've seen work elsewhere, or attempt what we've seen attempted but maybe not work elsewhere. So I think when we talk about small business or small-time landlords, that of course we have to think about how we define that. What constitutes small, and then of course we have to figure out how we can legally write policies that do that. But the short version is, without really knowing how to meaningfully follow through on that, I totally agree with the sentiment that like someone who lives in the house that they're mortgaging and then has bought or inherited a second property that's also on a mortgage, and the way they pay that mortgage is by renting it out or something. I think they're in a very different situation than a major realty firm in town that owns hundreds of properties. So the response should be different. But I think what you're speaking to, Erin, is that mechanisms that are in place to safeguard against those people losing their property or to help them make up their mortgage payments exist for people, even the small property owners, in a way that they don't for renters. So.
Yeah. Very true.
I think of there's this nonprofit management term called punching up. And so tenants can advocate for themselves and kind of punch up to the property owners. I'd love to see property owners advocate for themselves and punch up to the state and federal government. And hopefully from there, renters and small-time landlords, as you put it, Catherine, end up with a better deal than I think we're all currently getting when we think about how wealth nationally is so unequally distributed.
Yeah.
I need to join another call for Nucci Space, so I have to get off this one.
All right.
Thanks for sharing so much time with me.
Yeah. Thank you for talking like for an hour and a half. You did great.
And thank you everyone else who's been listening. Many of you have been here a very long time as well. I know most of you who were here at the beginning are probably gone. But thanks everybody for participating. We're going to keep doing these. The next one I do is going to be on Sunday, and I'll announce details of timing and who that'll be with before then. It'll be on Sunday.
Nice. And we're going to try, Athens for Everyone is going to try to do something similar to these sorts of things, but more in line with maybe candidate debates or forums, if we can figure out the technology.
Heck yeah.
But that's the goal for the next month or so. We're going to give that a shot, maybe.
Yeah, count me in on participating if there's a way to do it. And I'm happy to talk more. You know, I love Athens for Everyone and the platform. We didn't even get to talk about Palestine.
No, we didn't. There's so much on the platform.
Yeah, but I support it all. I support you and everyone in Athens for Everyone who's working to make this community a better, more equitable place.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye.